Hare Krishna Maharaj.
Oh, sorry. I hope we're back now.
Yes, yes. I think there was an internet problem. You were speaking about.
I remember what I was speaking of. So, to all people in the conference there, sorry for the interruption and also in Ustream. What I was saying is, I think part of the problem can be traced to a radical dualism in ISKCON, which I believe is in some ways, not in all ways perhaps, but in some ways irrational, mythological, and very dangerous. I can't see you, by the way. Is that intentional? Or thank you. That dualism is that radical, I believe, irrational, mythological dualism is dividing the world in the most extreme way between a sacred part of the world, which is almost culturally infallible and perfect, which is India, and a sort of a vulgar, profane Western world. And understanding the almost the mission of the Hare Krishna movement, not as trying to present Krishna and the science of bhakti yoga to a fallen world, but sort of trying to culturally colonize the Western world and other parts of the world, that there's this battle between Indian culture, not Krishna consciousness, Indian culture. That's why I say it's irrational, because it doesn't really exist. That somehow there's this culture war going on, which between Indian culture and Western culture. For example, one ISKCON guru, very well-known ISKCON guru, just posted an article saying that in Delhi, in Delhi, that a sweet shop closed, and this sweet shop had been open for 225 years, and the owner explained that the reason the sweet shop closed is because people were now buying Western sweets like chocolate and pastries rather than traditional Indian sweets. And so this famous guru then declared that ISKCON should take up as a type of sacred mission propagating, as he put it, Vedic sweets. So the idea that there is such a thing as Vedic sweets, and that they are basically non-different from Indian sweets, even Indian sweets that didn't exist 150 years ago or even 30 years ago. So this mythological idea that with all of the massive Muslim influence, Scythian, Central Asian influence, Western influence, that somehow Hindu-Muslim ethnicity in India is basically as close as you can ever get in this universe, the spiritual world. And therefore, ISKCON is engaged not merely in trying to get everyone to chant Hare Krishna and love Krishna and understand Prabhupada as Krishna's pure devotee, but actually we are trying to re-ethnicize the world. We are trying to culturally colonize the United States, England, Germany, France, Australia, etc., etc., etc. Culturally colonize and take over. And that's what we... So how does this relate to education? It relates to education for the simple reason that one of the hallmarks of Western civilization at its best is rationalism. Now, there's a very common habit among certain people in ISKCON of comparing the absolute most glorious cultural features of India with the most disgusting, vulgar degradations of the West, as opposed to... Anyway, you understand the point. So, I mean, when I started a program called Krishna West, some people were offended that I would connect those two words, Krishna and West. Some people actually thought that putting those two words together was offensive. Another very famous ISKCON guru, just a little YouTube video, which I'm in the process of writing a refutation for, and he said that all Western clothes are vulgar and just all about sex. In other words, right now I'm wearing a collar shirt, and this shirt is simply sex. This is nothing but sex. You can see it. I mean, it just reeks, it exudes passion, right? No, not really. But so part of Western culture is the importance of rational education. The importance of not merely learning the philosophy, but learning philosophy. The importance of training people to think independently. If you study the history of East and West, going back thousands of years, and it has been studied, you'll find that although you could say the greatest things come from Bharatvarsha, but it was the West and not the East that placed a real value on training people to be independent, rational thinkers, to educate them in that way, rather than merely indoctrinate them. And so my thesis, right or wrong, but I believe it's right, is that part of the fact that, or part of the reason that education is so shockingly neglected, it's like the, how do you say it? It's almost like the neglected child of ISKCON. The reason that education is so underemphasized, undervalued, is precisely because it's all connected to this mythological view of Vedic culture, and there's not much role, or education is not so important. You merely worship. You don't need to learn to think rationally. I think those things are actually connected. Another point I wanted to make is that what should ISKCON do? Even though it's so much fun to criticize, I will sort of renounce for the moment that pleasure and say something positive. So I see that education, there are some things which obviously we all know. We want devotees to learn about Krishna. We want devotees to learn a profession, become successful in the world for their own happiness, and also so that they can provide for their families. They can help to fund the Sankirtan movement. Not only fund it, but use their social influence, use their skills, their abilities, and so on. In many, many ways, devotees who are educated, who are successful in life, can do a lot for this movement. That's why when I took sannyas in 72, Prabhupada told me that the students, university students, are our best clients. That they are the most important people to preach to because they can do something in the world. They're the future leaders. So it's very much in ISKCON's interest, although many people in ISKCON don't understand it's in their interest, to give tremendous importance and resources and attention and energy to educating devotees, especially our own children. Although it's amazing that, let's just call a spade a spade. The history of the Hare Krishna movement is that most devotees thought it was much more important to build bigger and more opulent temples for bigger and more elaborate rituals than it was to save our own children. Let's just, we're all adults. Let's just give things their real name and say what it really is. And so we have a cultural problem. It's a cultural problem in ISKCON. So one issue is that obviously in every possible way it's in ISKCON's interest to educate our members, to educate especially our children, to whom we have our first duty and obligation. And also ISKCON desperately needs to create a class of public intellectuals. Public intellectuals, it's a class of people who are highly educated and deeply concerned about public issues. And there is, I'm in Spain right now, and I was just speaking about this with some devotees. There is in the world today, there is in the Western world, and increasingly around the world, a conversation going on. There's an international conversation which is being conducted basically according to the ground rules and you could say that the social sciences and historical methodologies of the Western world. But it's a conversation about public interest. How do you stop war? Why is the Middle East generating unlimited trouble and suffering and mayhem and murder in the world? And how do we really once and for all settle the post-colonial problem? What is the role of religion in public life? For example, in France and in places like Morocco, There are programs, actually began in Morocco, there are programs requiring Muslim imams, people who have the legal right to preach in Muslim institutions. They are required, as like people in other institutions, rabbis and priests and so on, to take courses, to get a certain amount of education, and that education includes teaching about tolerance and respect for other religions and the values of the country you live in. The values of the country you live in and how to respect those values, such as free speech, a Western value which allows us to have an international society for Krishna consciousness. So although some older devotees, even sannyasis, think that they see nothing but sex in the Western world, actually there are also human rights which make possible ISKCON. And so that conversation, which started in Morocco, the King of Morocco, and then it's now in France. And so that type of conversation, what is the role of religion? What is the role of spiritual leaders in the public life of a country? To what extent should spiritual leaders simply teach their doctrine? To what extent do they have an obligation to honor and respect the public values of the country they live in? To what extent do we do that? So these are conversations going on, and we should be participating in those conversations. Now, interfaith conferences are wonderful, and I participate in them, and it's a great service. But the people that participate in interfaith conferences, to some extent, talk to each other. And although there are ripple effects, to a great extent they talk to each other. Whereas there are other public conversations going on where you're really talking to the world. You're really talking to the world. And so we need to train public intellectuals, because without ISKCON education, basically we are just training people to give classes in temples, to preach to the already converted, or we're training devotees, not everywhere. I don't mean to say that nothing good is happening anywhere. Let me put it this way. We have to be careful. We don't just train devotees to perpetuate our isolated, how should I say, discourse, where the whole world is talking, everyone's talking to everybody else in the world. We are outside that conversation, and we have our own thing that we talk about, and no one is listening, or very few people are listening. In America, for example, among, you could say, native Western Americans, very few people are listening to us. I'm traveling around Europe right now, very few people are listening to us. So I see the role of education as training devotees not to continue this basically futile attempt to get the whole world to come to us, but rather training and educating devotees so they can go to the world and they can enter into the global conversations that are going on about war and peace and morality and spirituality and God and the soul, and how these interface with legislation and international treaties and so on. We need to go to the world, because the world's not coming to us. And that can never happen without education. So maybe the last point I'll make, and then I don't know if we take questions in this program, but right now I am not aware of any major campaign in ISKCON to promote education. I'm not aware of any such campaign. I mean, I give donations from time to time, different gurukulas, and then for a year or two I get their digital newsletters. But the point is, there is a major cultural flaw in the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, and I hope, ISKCON is not going to be like the textbook example of the Sikh corporation. I hope it won't be that, where if there's a problem and someone points it out, the person that points it out is the problem. The problem's not the problem. The person that points it out is the problem. And so the simple fact is that the Brahmins, the educators, the educators are the Brahmins are the educators. I see that there's a desperate need for the Ministry of Education and all the educators to educate ISKCON. It's really not just about educating the kids, although that's extremely important, and there's no service in the world that's more important than educating our own children or educating, older devotees. It's probably the most important service in the world. But apart from that, we have to educate ISKCON, because ISKCON at this point doesn't get it. ISKCON as a society doesn't get it. That's why there's one North American GBC at your meeting right now. I think that kind of says it all. Prabhupada said that he came to America, he came to the West, to establish a Brahminical class, to reconstitute a Brahminical class, because modern society is a headless body. Well, as much as modern society is a headless body, ISKCON is a disembodied head. And the point is that I hate to put it in these terms. But I'm just going to say it. And the worst that can happen is that I'll get less donations this year. Raise your hand if you think that was funny. Okay, so I mean, unless there is a major international campaign to explain to devotees that educating, enlightening devotees, training devotees to persuade the world to accept Krishna in an intelligent, relevant way is just as important as building another 500 temples where we display opulence and perform elaborate rituals. Unless we somehow convince ISKCON of that, they won't get it. Because the simple fact is that if you look at, and I'll be very blunt here, and I'm sure, some people will be appalled that I've reached, new levels of lowness or something in my public discourse. But the point is that the social body is like a pyramid, and the fewest number of people are the Brahmins, and then you get Kshatriyas, then you get Vaishyas and Shudras. And ISKCON, to a great extent, is a Vaishya and Shudra movement at the present time. Because for all the talk about we're saving the world, theoretically, and for all the talk, I mean, we're supposed to, but we're not exactly doing it, at least most of the world, we're not really saving right now. And so despite all the talk, education is not on top of ISKCON. Education, teaching, is not the most important program in ISKCON. And it's just not. It's just not. If you go to the Ministry of Education website and look up all the Gurukulas in the world, frankly, it is, make sure you have a little bottle of antidepressants next to you. Because it is actually shocking, outrageous, and almost literally unbelievable. It's almost unbelievable how little value is given in the so-called new Brahminical society to teaching. And so I think what I would suggest to you is that we desperately need a major international campaign, just like some people are traveling around with Lord Nityananda's his slippers or sandals, which which are used in ritual worship. There has to be an international campaign. If you, the Brahmins, don't convince ISKCON that it really needs to put the Brahminical class at the head of society, if we don't persuade them, who's going to persuade them? Who's going to teach them if the teachers don't teach them that? So I think that I would humbly request the Ministry of Education to figure out how to persuade ISKCON that Chaturvarnyam is actually important. And that education is not just sort of a little extra thing to make sure your kid doesn't become a drug addict or a Christian. that actually education is really the most important aspect of a spiritual movement. And there's a political reality of ISKCON. I mean, you know, we may dream that we are governed by completely rational people that just, you know, fairly come to decisions based on the evidence and what's right. But in the real world, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And so I think in the real world, there needs to be a major, major campaign to, frankly, to save ISKCON. Because all of this, you know, ISKCON, it's just like Lord Chaitanya gave the example of a garden. You know, you plant the devotional creeper, but then the weeds grow. And you have to periodically weed the garden. So gardens, you know, fill up with weeds, not only individually, but also collectively. You know, ISKCON as a society is also a type of devotional garden, and there are quite a few weeds in it right now.